I'm pleased to move notice of motion 423 that this House notes 1A, the unjustified and provocative actions of the Chinese Communist Government in blocking access to Victorian exports, including barley, wine, beef and lobster. B, that these actions by the Chinese Communist Government are not consistent with World Trade Organisation rules and do not honour the commitments made under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which I note is 5 years old just around now. C, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Victorian Government and the National Development and Reform Commission of the People's Republic of China, signed on the 8th of October 2018, known as the Belt and Road Initiative. D, the Framework Agreement between the Victorian Government and the National Development and Reform Commission of the People's Republic of China, signed on the 23rd of October 2019, in particular Article 1, cooperation principles, which have been ignored by the Chinese Communist Government. And 2, calls on the Andrews Labor Government to A, request that the Chinese Communist Government reverse its trade blockades of Victorian produce, and B, rebuke the Chinese Communist Government over its deliberate and damaging actions. It is with sadness that I begin this motion, because China has been a very good trading partner and indeed friend in many respects to Australia and to Victoria. And I put on record that my friend and indeed predecessor, the Honourable Rupert Hamer, Premier of Victoria, was the one who signed the Jiangsu sister state relationship with China in 1979. It was the first of these signed around Australia and was regarded as far-sighted, and I think it was. It actually opened up dialogue between Victoria and Jiangsu, and thereby the People's Republic of China, and indeed the Chinese people. And we should not make any mistake about the distinctions between the Chinese Communist Government and the Chinese people. The Chinese people are people who are our friends and people that we wish to engage with on every possible level. But the government has embarked in this recent period on a series of actions which are damaging to the relationship, but also damaging to, in particular, the trade between Australia and China, but in our context, Victoria and China. And we need to be quite clear that this is something we can take a stand on, something we can make clear statements about. It is true, as people will point out, I'm sure, in this debate, that foreign trade is primarily a federal responsibility, and that is true. And the federal government has clear responsibilities here, and I have no doubt that they will discharge them. But that equally does not mean that we cannot have a clear view, and this chamber has on many occasions expressed views about trade, about international links, about international relations on a number of levels. And in this circumstance, where Victorian trade is directly threatened, we need to be both thoughtful and moderate, but also firm and clear. We need to make it absolutely crystal clear that what is occurring, the threats, the actuality in some cases of blockages and blockades, and the under-the-radar talk, and what are in effect threats, are wrong and should be called out as such. As the motion says, they're not in the spirit of the relationship. They are not in the actuality of the World Trade Organisation principles, selecting goods from one country or one jurisdiction and singling them out in that way. And the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement also lays out rights and privileges and agreement between the nations with respect to movement of goods and people, indeed, between both jurisdictions. And some of the actions that have occurred in the recent period are not consistent with those principles either. And I think it's important in this context also to state that the state government has signed an agreement which we think is an unwise agreement through the Belt and Road Initiatives, and there are 2 of these, and I invite people to read them. They can see that they're in many respects very weak documents, but they are also lopsided documents. They are documents that are more favourable to the Chinese Communist Party and its focus, and less favourable to Victoria, indeed, in this context, but Australia in the broader context. I note the strong focus on infrastructure in this, in the document, in the 2019 document. A very strong focus on infrastructure, roadmaps. There is in each of the agreements an article that deals with the settlement of differences, and I'll quote one of them. This is the 2019 document. Both sides will settle differences in interpretation, application or implementation of this agreement through friendly consultations. Well, that's a very weak dispute settlement clause, of course, but it is nonetheless something that can be activated if the government is actually arguing that these have any merit. I don't think they actually help Victoria terribly much, and we heard yesterday in the chamber when we asked the question about whether the Minister for Agriculture or the Premier had activated any of those clauses. They had not. They had not. I say that we can't be merely mouthed in this process at this point. I think we need to be quite firm, thoughtful, but clear that what is going on is quite wrong. And it's interesting to look at the articles that are coming through today, indeed, on a lot of the newspapers at the moment. It's very clear that, in fact, the wool is one that is in the gun with China talking under the radar. But there are 7 sectors listed: wine, lobster, sugar, barley, timber. All of these are significant risks for us in this period, and we've got to be, quite firm that we need to stand up strongly and stand up clearly. This is an opportunity for the chamber to take a position and to say no. What is being done here in China is wrong. Now, we've heard the story of lobster being, on the tarmac and facing significant losses. We know that Victorian wine producers are terribly worried, and people can read the Weekly Times stories today and see that a number of the wine groups are very worried about the fact that wine will not be able to get into China. And this operates on several levels. Let's be clear. There are sort of formal bans, and there's obviously been some formal bans. Coal has hit hurdles, as people know, in certain circumstances, and we've heard of what's happened to barley, and this chamber has dealt with that. And I'm not going to put on record all the details of the barley movements out of Victoria, but barley is clearly being hit quite sharply. But wine is also on the hit list. And, this can be done by a formal blockage, or it can be done by this surreptitious campaign of whispering and making importers in China cautious and afraid to import new orders, new shipments. And that is now happening across a wide front. Importers are fearful, and the federal government has indeed given advice to people here who are exporting to China that they need to check carefully and make decisions that factor in the risk that is involved. So if you're a small producer trying to export wine into China, for example, you face the challenge today as to whether to send a new shipment to China with the uncertainty of the bans and the go-slows and the unfavourable attitude of the Chinese Communist Party in China. And I say that this is completely and utterly unfair to our producers. It is unfair to those small firms that are seeking to do the right thing to export and build jobs here. It will have a significant impact. It is having a significant impact now. Now, Obviously, there is a large international context, and that's one aspect. But this is actually a set of decisions that are being made by the Chinese Communist Government now to disfavour Australian and, indeed in our context, Victorian exports. I should say that much of the links to China and the agricultural and other exports, whether it be education or the long list of success tourism, the long list of exports that we've had successfully built up with China, has been bipartisan policy. Ted Baillieu, new Premier, led the largest delegation into China in China's history, trade delegation from Victoria. And that delivered very significant benefits to China and to Victoria. It delivered a great increase in exchange, not only education exports, tourism, even aged care. I was Minister for Aged Care at the time, and there was a very significant focus on potential exports of knowledge and approaches with aged care support for older Chinese that could be moved from Victoria into China. So my point here is that, you know, this is not something any of us want. On one level, we have to keep talking positively to the Chinese government, the Communist government, and maintain the links with the Chinese community, which is so important. But we also have to speak plainly and say that what is going on is wrong and it is not consistent. And Victoria's government is not without influence in this. They can actually speak directly and plainly to the Chinese Communist government, to provincial governments even, to say, actually, this is damaging and it's wrong. And I think that they can also speak publicly, and I think they should, and hence the motion is in the form that it's in. So I think this is it's a very important set of moments that we face with this challenge. I'm not pretending that this is easy. I'm not pretending that any of us would have wished this. I don't think the state government's Belt and Road focus has been helpful. I don't think that it was the right agreements to sign. We've been quite clear about that, and we think that they're, you know, in many respects, they're not worth the paper they're written on in terms of delivering for Victoria, but they do deliver a political and otherwise economic benefit for China. The focus on infrastructure is strong in those agreements. Now, of course, Chinese involvement in infrastructure is, in general, appropriate. But where a Chinese Communist government-controlled entity is involved, we need to think carefully about that too. And we've seen contractual disputes with some of these firms. So they're not like a normal firm, they're actually a government wholly owned subsidiary, a wholly owned and controlled government subsidiary of the Chinese Communist government. So a state government having a legal and financial dispute with a firm like that faces certain challenges. So let's be clear about that too. But the key point today is that agreed strategy to expand our exports over a longer period, all parties, I think. And now we're hitting very heavy weather. And I think that we can speak up. I think the chamber can speak up, but I think the state government under Daniel Andrews can speak up as well and should speak up in favour of our exporters.